USS Saratoga played a pivotal role in the evolution of naval aviation for the United States Navy, and throughout her career, she served as a vital component of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nicknamed Sara, she was the fifth vessel to bear the name of the famous Revolutionary War battle that resulted in the surrender of an entire British army. She helped to hold the line during the early days of the Pacific War, and despite suffering significant damage on multiple occasions, she always made it back to port safely, which earned her the reputation of being a lucky ship. After the war, she was used as a target during the Operation Crossroads nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll, which is where she ultimately met her end. Saratoga's keel was laid down on September 25, 1920, by the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. Originally laid down as a Lexington-class battlecruiser, construction was halted in February 1922 after the Washington Naval Treaty was signed. The treaty called for the cancellation and scrapping of any new capital ships under construction by the signing nations. However, a provision was added to the treaty which allowed the signatories to convert 2 of the capital ships that they had under construction into aircraft carriers. As Saratoga and her sister Lexington were the furthest along in construction of the 6 members of their class, they were selected to be converted and finished as aircraft carriers. The problem with this, though, was that the tonnage cap for new carrier construction had been set at 27,000 tons per carrier and was too low for any practical conversion of the 2 battlecruisers, which would have displaced over 43,000 tons. An exception was added to the treaty, under strong pressure from the U.S. delegation, that allowed the capital ships undergoing conversion to aircraft carriers an additional 6,000 tons, or 33,000 tons altogether. But even this increase in tonnage was not enough, as it was estimated that Saratoga would displace over 35,000 tons when completed. In the end, it took creative interpretation of a clause within the treaty to allow the conversion to go forward. Saratoga was reauthorized as an aircraft carrier on July 1, 1922, and launched almost 3 years later on April 7, 1925. She had an overall length of 888 feet, a beam of 106 feet, and displaced just under 36,000 tons. Her flight deck at the time of her commissioning measured just over 866 feet in length and had the same width as her beam at its widest point. She had 2 hydraulically powered elevators that were both located amidships in the vicinity of her island and on the center line of the ship. Saratoga was designed to carry around 80 operational aircraft. When the Navy adopted the practice of tying up spare aircraft to the top of their hangar decks, about 30 more aircraft were added to her total, albeit in a non-operational capacity as they were somewhat disassembled. Saratoga and her sister were by far the most well-protected class of the pre-war aircraft carriers when it came to armor protection, and this was due mostly to their origins as battlecruisers. Their main armor belt was retained, but it was reduced in height to save weight, and the general line of her hull remained unaltered, as did her torpedo protection system, because they had both already been built by the time her construction had been halted. So Saratoga was an aircraft carrier that featured the armor protection of a battlecruiser, at least when it came to her hull. Saratoga used a turbo-electric power plant. 16 oil-fired boilers produced the steam that powered her 4 turbo-electric generators. These sent 180,000 shaft horsepower to her 8 electric motors, which turned her 4 screws. She had a maximum speed of 33 knots and a range of 10,000 nautical miles when cruising at 10 knots. Early on, the U.S. Navy was not entirely convinced that a carrier's aircraft alone could effectively protect it from threats. Owing to this, Saratoga was initially equipped with what could be referred to as a main battery of 8 8-inch 55 caliber Mark 9 guns. These were mounted in 4 twin turrets that were located in superfiring pairs before and aft of her island superstructure, and were the same guns used on several classes of U.S. heavy cruisers. For air defense, Saratoga was initially equipped with only 12 single-mounted 5-inch 25 caliber guns. These were located on sponsons near each corner of her flight deck. Absent of light anti-aircraft guns when commissioned, several 50-caliber machine guns were soon added in short order. Saratoga was commissioned into the U.S. Navy on November 16, 1927. She got underway for her shakedown cruise just after the calendar turned to 1928, and on January 11th, Commander Mark A. Mitcher made the first landing on Saratoga when he brought his air group aboard the carrier that afternoon. He would also serve aboard her as her executive officer from June 1934 to June 1935. On January 27th, the rigid airship Los Angeles moored to Saratoga's stern and took on fuel and stores from the carrier. The experiment went off without a hitch, and that afternoon, Saratoga got underway for the Pacific. She spent the rest of 1928 training and conducting exercises off the West Coast while calling San Pedro, California, her home. During the 1930s, Saratoga operated mostly out of San Diego and San Pedro, except during the annual fleet problems and her regular overhauls at the Puget Sound Navy Yard. Saratoga usually played a major role in the fleet problems, as they aided in the development of carrier tactics, and her importance was recognized by the fact that she was always a high-priority target for the opposing forces. She even became a movie star during this decade when the 1932 picture titled Helldivers, starring a young Clark Gable, was filmed aboard her. On January 6, 1941, Saratoga entered the Puget Sound Navy Yard for an overhaul and modernization. The forward part of her flight deck was widened, her anti-aircraft battery was updated, and she received one of the new CXA-M1 radar sets that had been delivered to the Navy by RCA. After participating in an exercise in May and making 2 trips to Hawaii between June and October, Saratoga once again entered the Puget Sound Navy Yard. Her AA battery received further updating and new fire control radars were installed. This work lasted into late November, and on December 7, 1941, she had just arrived in San Diego to embark her air group, who had been training ashore while the ship was refitting up north in Washington. She got underway for Pearl Harbor the following morning as the flagship of Carrier Division 1 with Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch embarked. 14 Marine Corps Brewster Buffalo fighters of VMF 221 were tied to her decks as well for delivery to Oahu. Saratoga arrived at Pearl on December 15th, refueled, and departed for Wake Island the next morning with the Marine fighters still on her decks. She was now part of Task Force 17 under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, and on the 17th she rendezvoused with the cargo ship Tangier, which was carrying troops and supplies bound for Wake Island. With Lexington and Enterprise's task forces providing distant cover, Saratoga's group began their run into Wake. However, her force was delayed by the slow speed of its fleet oiler and by the need to refuel its destroyers on the 21st. After receiving reports of Japanese carrier aircraft over the island and Japanese landings on it, the relief force was recalled on the 22nd, and Wake fell to the Japanese the next day. Saratoga delivered the Marine aircraft to Midway on Christmas Day before standing into Pearl on December 29th. She put to sea again on the 31st to patrol the waters south of Oahu, and on January 11th, while attempting to rendezvous with Enterprise about 500 miles southwest of Oahu, she was struck by a torpedo fired by the Japanese submarine I-6. The explosion flooded 3 of her boiler rooms and reduced her maximum speed to 16 knots. Her list was quickly corrected, and she reached Pearl Harbor 2 days later on the 13th. 6 men were killed in the blast. While undergoing temporary repairs at Pearl Harbor, her 8-inch guns were removed so that they could be used as shore batteries around Oahu. She then proceeded to Puget Sound for permanent repairs and a modernization. Here, anti-torpedo blisters were added to her hull, and her anti-aircraft battery received a significant upgrade with the addition of 4 twin-barreled 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose gun mounts. Her older 5-inch 25 caliber single mounts were replaced by 8 5-inch 38 caliber guns, which were also single mounts. As the new 5-inch guns were heavier than the old ones, only 2 could be added to her corner gun platforms. The space formerly reserved for the third gun on each platform was then used to add an additional quadruple 1.1-inch 75 caliber mount. She also received several other quad 1.1-inch mounts, and 32 20mm Oerlikon autocannons were installed as well. 6 at the base of her funnel, and the other 26 were distributed along the sides and rear of her flight deck. When Saratoga's repairs were completed in late May, her armament consisted of 16 5-inch guns, 9 quadruple 1.1-inch gun mounts, and 32 20mm Oerlikons. Saratoga departed Puget Sound on May 22nd, bound for San Diego, where she arrived on the 25th. As storm clouds gathered north of Midway, Saratoga was left waiting in San Diego for the mundane process of loading planes and stores to be completed. She also had to collect escorts and was waiting on Rear Admiral Fitch to arrive from the South Pacific. These events collectively led to her being unable to depart San Diego until June 1st. She arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 6th and departed the next day after refueling. On the 11th, she rendezvoused with and transferred 34 aircraft to Hornet and Enterprise to replenish their depleted air groups. The 3 carriers then turned north to counter the Japanese thrust in the Aleutians, but were ordered back to Pearl Harbor, which they reached on June 13th. In late June, she ferried Marine and Army aircraft to Midway to replace the losses incurred there during the battle earlier in the month. Afterwards, Saratoga sailed for the South Pacific and spent July preparing for operations in the Solomon Islands. On the morning of August 7th, she turned into the wind and launched 24 Dauntlesses and a dozen Wildcats to attack targets on the island of Guadalcanal, including the nearly completed airfield. She provided air cover for the landings over the following 2 days, during which her pilots helped to fend off several Japanese air attacks on the transport ships in Savo Sound. After withdrawing to refuel on the night of August 8th, Saratoga continued to operate southeast of the Solomons over the next week in order to protect the sea lanes to Guadalcanal and to await the expected arrival of the Japanese carriers. On August 19th, she rendezvoused with the escort carrier Long Island and covered her approach to Guadalcanal. Long Island was ferrying the Marine aircraft that would operate out of Henderson Field over the coming months and successfully flew them off the next day. Saratoga returned to her station southeast of Guadalcanal on the 21st, after escorting Long Island to safety, and remained in the vicinity for the next several days to provide cover for 2 transports attempting to reach the beleaguered island. The expected Japanese counterattack began to materialize when a Japanese transport force was detected on August 23rd, and Saratoga launched a strike against it. The strike was unable to find the Japanese and spent the night on Guadalcanal as they lacked sufficient fuel to make it home. As they were returning to Saratoga the next day, the first contact report on enemy carriers was received. 2 hours later, Saratoga launched a strike consisting of 31 Dauntlesses and 8 Avengers. Saratoga's aircraft sighted the light carrier Ryujo shortly after Enterprise's planes had finished their attack and struck her with 3 1,000-pound bombs and a torpedo. Ryujo capsized and sank about 4 hours later. On the afternoon of the 23rd, as an enemy strike bore down on the U.S. task forces, Saratoga hastily cleared her deck of 2 Dauntlesses and 5 Avengers. These planes found and damaged the Japanese seaplane tender Chitose. Meanwhile, Saratoga managed to escape detection due to cloud cover, and the Japanese concentrated their attack on Enterprise and severely damaged her. After recovering her returning aircraft, Saratoga refueled on the 25th and resumed patrolling east of the Solomons. On August 31st, while operating inside the infamous area east of the Solomons known as Torpedo Junction, Saratoga was struck by a torpedo fired from the Japanese submarine I-26. The torpedo slammed into her starboard side just aft of her island, but thanks to the protection offered by her newly installed torpedo blister, only 1 fire room was flooded. This in itself wasn't much damage, especially when compared to the torpedo strikes Wasp and North Carolina received about 2 weeks later. But the torpedo strike caused multiple short circuits, which in turn damaged Saratoga's turboelectric power plant and left her dead in the water. The heavy cruiser Minneapolis took her under tow while she flew her aircraft off to Espiritu Santo. By early afternoon, Saratoga's engineers had improvised a circuit out of the burned wreckage of her main control board, and she could make 10 knots. After repairs at Tongatabu in early September, Saratoga arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 21st for permanent repairs. Saratoga returned to the South Pacific on December 5th and spent the next several months providing support for minor operations in the Solomons. When Enterprise withdrew for a much-needed overhaul in early May 1943, Saratoga became the only operational American fleet carrier in the South Pacific. She was soon reinforced, though, by the British fleet carrier Victorious, and, after familiarizing each other with their capabilities and tactics, the duo covered the amphibious landings on New Georgia in late June and early July. It was during this time that Rear Admiral DeWitt Ramsey decided to take advantage of each carrier's strengths. He ordered the Victorious Avengers to be exchanged for 24 Wildcats from VF-3, as Victorious had difficulty operating the large Avenger, and the British carrier possessed better facilities for coordinating fighter operations. Unfortunately, Ramsey never got a chance to test his reorganization, as the Japanese made no effort to attack, and he was replaced by Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman on July 26th. Victorious sailed for home on July 31st. Carrier Air Group 12 flew aboard on August 1st, and the new Grumman F-6F Hellcat replaced the venerable Wildcat, and during August and September she operated mostly out of Espiritu Santo. While refueling at sea on the night of October 12th, she collided with the oiler Atascosa, which caused damage to 3 of her portside 20mm Oerlikons. 10 days later, the light aircraft carrier Princeton joined Saratoga's task force, which was now designated as Task Force 38. On October 27th, Task Force 38 provided air cover for the invasion of the Treasury Islands, which was part of the preliminary operations for the invasion of Bougainville Island, scheduled for November 1st. On the morning of the 1st, Saratoga's aircraft neutralized Japanese airfields at the northern end of the island and on Buka Island. They destroyed 15 Japanese aircraft while losing 3 Hellcats, 1 Dauntless, and 2 Avengers to all causes. Saratoga and her task force attacked Rabaul on the 5th to prevent Japanese surface units from interfering with the ongoing amphibious operations. 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer were damaged in the attack. After a second strike on Rabaul on the 11th and a strike on Nauru on the 19th, Saratoga departed for an overhaul at the Mare Island Navy Yard, where she arrived on December 9th. Her overhaul was completed in early January 1944, and by the end of the month she was ready to support the invasion of the Marshall Islands. Saratoga, now a member of Task Group 58.4, attacked Watje and Taroa from January 29th through the 31st, before attacking Eniwetok Atoll from the 3rd through the 6th of February, and again from the 10th to the 12th. She then provided close air support and the combat air patrol over the island until February 28th. On March 4th, Saratoga departed Majuro to reinforce the British Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean. She rendezvoused at sea on March 27th with a Royal Navy force and arrived at Trincomalee, Ceylon, which is present-day Sri Lanka, on the 31st. During the next 2 weeks, she conducted intensive training and rehearsing with the British carrier Illustrious for an attack on the port city of Sabang, which was scheduled for April 19th. The attack caught the Japanese by surprise, and there was no aerial opposition, so the escort strafed the airfield and destroyed 24 aircraft on the ground. The port facilities and oil storage tanks were heavily damaged, and 1 small freighter was sunk. The Japanese attempted to attack the fleet as it was withdrawing, but the combat air patrol shot down all of the Japanese bombers. The task force then attacked the oil refinery at Surabaya, Java, on May 17th. Little damage was inflicted on the refinery, and only 1 small ship was sunk. Saratoga was ordered back to Pearl Harbor the next day. After arriving at Pearl in mid-June, Saratoga made her way to Puget Sound for an overhaul which lasted until mid-September. She departed San Francisco on the 24th with 1,500 passengers and cargo bound for Pearl Harbor. Upon her arrival in Hawaiian waters, she was assigned to Carrier Division 11 along with USS Ranger to train night pilots and develop night flying doctrine. Saratoga continued this duty for almost 4 months, but in late January 1945, she was rushed out of Pearl Harbor to form a night fighter task group with Enterprise after it had been realized that light carriers were too small to safely conduct night operations. Saratoga arrived at Ulithi on February 7th and got underway 3 days later with Enterprise and the rest of the Fast Carrier Task Force for a series of airstrikes on the Japanese home islands. She was assigned to provide fighter cover while the remaining carriers launched the strikes, but her fighters managed to raid 2 Japanese airfields as well. The force then made their way to Iwo Jima, and on the 21st, Saratoga was detached to join the amphibious forces and carry out night patrols over Iwo Jima and night heckler missions over nearby Chichijima. As she approached her operating area at around 5 p.m. on the 21st, she was attacked and, taking advantage of low cloud cover and Saratoga's insufficient escort, 6 Japanese planes scored 5 bomb hits in the span of only 3 minutes. 3 of the aircraft also struck her. Saratoga's forward flight deck was holed and wrecked, her starboard side was holed twice as well, and large fires were started in her hangar deck. Another attack, 2 hours later, added an additional bomb hit to her flight deck. By 8:15, her fires were under control, and the carrier was able to recover 6 of her fighter planes. In all, 40 planes, 31 Hellcats and 9 Avengers, had been destroyed, and 123 men had been killed. Another 192 were wounded. Saratoga was ordered to the West Coast for repairs, and she arrived at Puget Sound on March 16th. Due to Saratoga's age and the number of modern carriers in service, the Navy decided to fully modify her into a training carrier. Her aft elevator and its machinery were removed, and the opening was plated over. Her forward elevator was replaced with a larger model, and part of the hangar deck was converted into classrooms. Saratoga departed Puget Sound on May 22nd, and she resumed training pilots at Pearl Harbor in early June. She ceased training duty on September 6th and sailed from Hawaii on the 9th to begin her participation in Operation Magic Carpet. By the end of her final Magic Carpet voyage, Saratoga had brought home over 29,000 Pacific War veterans, which was by far the most of any individual ship. At the time, she also held the record for the greatest number of landings on a carrier with a total of 98,549 landings over her lifetime. In January 1946, Saratoga was assigned to Operation Crossroads, which was conducted at Bikini Atoll, to test the effect of the atomic bomb on naval vessels. She survived the first detonation, Test Able, which was an airburst on July 1st, with only minor damage, but she was mortally wounded by Test Baker on July 25th, which was an underwater blast that was detonated under a landing craft 500 yards from the carrier. Salvage efforts were prevented by radioactivity, and 7.5 hours after the blast, Saratoga slipped beneath the surface of the lagoon. She was struck from the Naval Vessel Registry on August 15, 1946. Saratoga earned 4 campaign decorations and 8 battle stars for her service in World War II. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.